Hi, and welcome back. Modules that offer creative and unique signal flow are among my favorites. And that's because they open up a lot of patching possibilities and really set what you can do with the modular apart from other hardware synths. Unfortunately, they're also not the easiest to understand. All that is very true for Step 8 from Joranalogue. It's a very creative and powerful module. But if things like custom sequencers, track and hold, sequential switch, shift register, trigger divider, or hocketing sound confusing, this video is for you. This is Step 8 with all its sliders, switches and jacks. Instead of going over all of these at once, I will focus in depth on its core functions in short chapters. To start off though, it's good to know these three switches here on the top are used to set the module's basic way of operating. The chapters of this video are related to these switches, and I show the settings for these in the top left of my visualizations. I start with all switches to the left to explain its basic operation. If you're interested in lots of patches and more hands-on action with Step 8, make sure to watch the videos from fellow YouTubers Divkit and Brice as well. I'll link to those in the video description. And if you like to support my videos or you want to get access to PDF sheets with hundreds of patch ideas I used in my videos, have a look at my Patreon. You can also support my channel through affiliate links in the video description. But now, let's dive right in. It's easiest to approach Step 8 in cycle mode. Let's have a look at the basic operation of the module set up as a sequential switch. Throughout this video, I will use a simplified visualization of the module to demonstrate how it works. I reorganized some of the in and outputs to help you understand the signal flow. Here you see the core of the module with only a single signal input, the 8 sliders and the 8 analog outputs. The signal input can be used for all sorts of signals, gate or trigger patterns, audio, sequences, control voltages and so on. And in cycle mode, that single input is potentially connected to all 8 steps, but only one at a time. For example, the first one. If you feed something like a simple sine wave LFO into the input, the signal passes on to the active output. The slider can be used to attenuate the signal all the way to a closed signal. And as you can see, all other outputs are muted, even with the sliders up. This setup functions like a sequential switch, because from here you can switch through the outputs in sequential order. This activates the steps one at a time, and the input signal will follow along to that step, from the first to the second, the third, fourth, and so on. Every time the input is connected to the next output with the others muted. From the last step, it automatically jumps back to the first. Here you see that example with an LFO in real life. The sliders all have lovely LEDs, so you can see the signal present at that output. If you attenuate it, you can see the signal getting weaker. This is great to visualize what's going on. Then, of course, switching or stepping through the outputs is a crucial part. On the Step 8, you can cycle through the outputs with this manual button, or you can send something like a trigger, complex gate pattern, or steady clock to the step input to automate the process. Every mode and way of operation of Step 8 creates powerful functions. I'll give you just a few examples for each of them just to get you started. For example, with a sine wave LFO at the input, you can send one or multiple outputs to different destinations. In a simple voice, you could send one to the pitch of an oscillator, one to the filter cutoff, and one to modulate the VCA. You can use the sliders to attenuate the signal to each destination. In this setup, the outputs that aren't patched have no effect, but those will still be active when you cycle through the steps. Looking back at the module though, each of the 8 steps also has an individual gate output. These output a high voltage visualized with a light when that step is active. Among many other things, these gate outputs can be used to self-patch the module. For example, by sending them to the reset input. This example limits the step count to 3. As soon as the fourth step becomes active, it immediately resets the module to the first. A second LFO is added to modulate the frequency of the input LFO for some added depth. And a clock is progressing the step 8 automatically. Beside the main outputs and gates, step 8 also has a scan output. This output always outputs the result of the active stage. In the example with the LFO and all sliders up, the LFO will just come out of the stage output unaltered. But you can use the sliders to set different output levels for the stages, and even use it to mute the signal during a step. Here you see that effect with an LFO. But you can use anything you like. Here, a rotating sample with a steady clock is sent to the input. Every time it's triggered, the clock also advances step 8 to the next step. Now you can use the sliders to dial in the volume for the head on that step, or even mute it. You can easily turn step 8 into a sequential voltage generator, for example, to create melodies. That is because the input is normal to plus 5 volt. That means that if you don't patch a signal to the input, it acts as if it has a steady 5 volt signal patched to the input. The scan output, as always, will output the active stage, in this case the first step. With the sliders open, the output is also plus 5 volt. But you can now use the slider to attenuate the 5 volt input signal and set a voltage between 5 volt and 0 volt. You can do so for each of the steps, send a steady clock to the input, and step 8 is an unquantized CV sequencer. Of course, you can send this sequence to an oscillator and create some melodies. You already saw the reset input, which is useful here as well. You can create shorter sequences by self-patching the module, or send something like a random gate or uneven clock division like 11 or 13 to create interesting patterns. Step 8 also has a pause input. This holds the current step if you send it a gate input. So again, a fun place to patch gates or clock divisions. And it also has a reverse input. If there's a high gate input here, every step increase progresses to the left instead of the right. If you use a steady clock to the step and a divide by 16 clock division gate to the reverse, you get a ping-pong sequencer. But again, experiment with uneven divisions, for example a divide by 7. Remember, you can use a CV sequence like this to do other things than create melodies. You can modulate things like a filter, wave folder, sample length, and so on. The final input on step 8 is the stage input. With this input, you can select one of the 8 stages with a voltage between 0 and 5 volt. So, for example, a looping envelope with that range will sweep through the active stages. This is a nice way to visualize the incoming voltage. When you take that envelope and trigger it with a clock, you can tap any of the stages and use it as a trigger delay. But you can also feed the module audio or something like a random voltage. Because each of the steps is active when the incoming voltage is within a certain range, this is effectively a window comparator. For example, you can trigger 2 events. One when the incoming voltage is at a high level, and one when the incoming voltage is at a low level. But you can also send it a random step voltage to select one of 8 values controlled with the sliders. For example, to modulate a filter. Because step 8 is analog and high quality, it can handle audio rate and audio signals very well. Instead of using a clock to create 8-step sequences, you can send a high-speed oscillator to the step input. Now the sliders can be used to create an 8-phase waveform. The output is sent to an oscilloscope so you can see the resulting waveforms. I also want to cover hocketing in this chapter. That's because we're in the right mode to do so, and it's very easy on step 8. Hocketing is a term for a simple idea, and that is to use a single sequence, but divide the notes of that sequence one step at a time over multiple voices. For example, 3. With step 8, this is very easy. Feed a CV sequence to the input for the melody, and use the sequencer's clock to progress each step of the melody to the next output of the step 8. Now you can patch the outputs of each of the steps to an oscillator in a separate voice. And you can use the step gate outputs to trigger an envelope opening a filter in that voice. Of course, you can make the voices as complex as you like. Patch the fourth gate output to the reset if you want the step 8 to cycle through just the 3 steps. If you create 3 distinct different voices, maybe even with one of them an octave above or below the others, this can lead to great results. Let's have a look at the switch that selects either track and hold or sample and hold. I'm going to keep this chapter short because there's a lot of good information out there already, including these 2 videos I made. You can watch them later if you like, but let's do a quick reminder. A track and hold circuit has 2 states. A track state, which means the output tracks or follows the input signal as you see here, and a hold state, in which it holds the value that was present at the input at the time of switching states. A sample and hold circuit only has one state. You can feed it an input signal, and whenever it receives a gate or trigger, it samples and holds a new value, until it receives another trigger and samples and holds the new value, and so on. You can watch the videos I mentioned here, and they're filled with fun ideas for sample and track and hold modules. Step 8 can easily perform all of those. In case you're interested, you can turn step 8 into a regular sample and hold module by setting the switches to shift, all and sample. Now the first output is a sample and hold output that samples at every trigger or gate at the step input. And for a simple track and hold module, set the switches to cycle, all and track, and patch the third gate to the reset. Now, the first output is a simple track and hold circuit that switches states with every trigger or gate at the step input. The solo versus all switch adds another layer of possibilities and complexity. Here you see the module as we used before, with step 8 in cycle, solo and track mode. It receives a steady clock, cycles through the steps, tracks the incoming voltage, and because it's in solo mode, only one step is sending a signal at the output. The others are muted. Let's reset and switch to cycle, all and track mode. In this mode, step 8 still cycles through the steps, and the active step will track and hold. But the other steps are not muted. As you can see here, step 1 is active and tracking the incoming voltage. If you press the button or the module receives a trigger at the step input, the active step will hold the current voltage. And at the same time, the next step becomes active and starts tracking. If it receives another trigger, the second step will hold its current value, and the next step starts tracking, and so on. Steps will hold a value until they become active again and start tracking the input voltage. Here's a simple example with step 8 in cycle, all and track and hold mode. A smooth random voltage is sent to the input and the module receives a clock at the step input. The first output is opening a filter in a simple voice and the fifth output a filter in another simple voice. When cycling through the steps, each time it passes through the first step, it will track and hold a new value for the first voice, and when it passes through the fifth step, it will track and hold a new value for the second voice. I saved the shift mode for last, and that's because it's the least common, but perhaps also the most fun and creative one. If you followed along, it should be easy to understand. Let's start with our familiar setup, but in shift, solo and track mode. There's an LFO at the input and the first step is active, tracking the incoming voltage. When the module receives a trigger, and I'm going to pause the animation here again, the voltage present at the first step will be held. But instead of holding it at the first step, and directing the input signal to the next step, the held voltage will be shifted to the next output. In shift mode, the input signal is always connected to the first step, and with each trigger, each output is shifted to the next. In this example, the module is also in solo mode, which means only the selected step is sending an output signal. So, unpause, as you can see, after the trigger step 1, is no longer sending a tracked voltage anymore. If step 8 receives another trigger, the held voltage from step 2 will be shifted to step 3, on another trigger to step 4, and so on, until it comes back to step 1 and it outputs the tracked voltage again. When in shift mode, with all steps active in track and hold, this becomes even more clear. When step 8 receives a trigger, pause animation, it will hold the value at that moment and shift it to the next step. But this time, unpause, the first step remains active as well, and it keeps tracking the input signal. Another trigger, pause, will hold a new value made with the first step, shift that to the second, and at the same time shift the voltage held at the second step to the third. Unpause. And so on. In this setup, the first step always keeps tracking and the held voltages keep shifting to the right. With this mode, we finally arrived at my favorite patch with step 8 so far. Here you see almost the same patch as used for hocketing, with a single sequencer driving step 8 and 3 voices. This time though, all 3 envelopes are triggered at the same time via the step output. And step 8 is set to shift, all and sample mode. Instead of rotating the sequence through the 3 voices, it now sends the same sequence to all 3 voices. The first voice receives the same sequence as the sequencer sends. The second voice receives that same sequence with 1 step delay, and the third sequence with 2 steps delay. Of course, you can tap the sequences from step 4 or 7, for example, to create longer delays. All these ideas have lots of applications. For example, you can use the same concept with a trigger pattern. In this case, a single pattern is sent to trigger multiple samples. Depending on which output you use, a sample player receives the incoming pattern with 1 or more steps delay. The timing of the trigger and step inputs is crucial in a setup like this. With the sequencer I use, I had to patch up an envelope to delay the step trigger a tiny bit. Another fun sequencing idea is to patch a crossfader before the input of step 8. This allows you to crossfade between 2 inputs. For example, a sample and hold generator that is following a clock, also used to drive step 8, and the last output of the step 8. Now you can crossfade between a random step input or feed an 8-step pattern through step 8 and back to the input, essentially creating a loop. In this case, the resulting sequence is quantized and then used to sequence a simple voice. In this video, I focused on the different modes with core examples, but step 8 can do a lot more. If you have other patch ideas, let me know about them in the comments. If you want to browse through my modular videos, have a look at these playlists, and as always, smash that like, subscribe and bell button if you want to see more modular content from me. But that's it for now. Thanks for watching and see you next time.